Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I had been planning my summer hike in Yosemite for months. I needed a break from the city and thought a solo adventure would be the perfect escape. I started early in the morning, the sun was barely up, and the air was still cool. The park was beautiful, everything I had hoped for. I took my time, snapping pictures and enjoying the tranquility. It was a perfect day. Around midday, I was taking a break near a small stream when I heard voices approaching. 3 people emerged from the trail, a man and 2 women. They looked friendly enough, all smiles and relaxed postures. We chatted for a bit. They said they were also hiking and had been coming to Yosemite for years. They seemed to know the area well, and I felt comfortable with them. They invited me to join them, saying they knew a great spot not too far off the main trail where we could get an incredible view of the valley. I hesitated for a moment but decided to go along. I figured it would be nice to have some company for a while. We walked and talked, and they seemed genuinely nice. As we moved further off the main path, the trail became less defined. The man, who introduced himself as David, led the way. He pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about past hikes. The women, Sarah and Emily, walked behind me, keeping up a friendly chatter. I didn't think much of it at the time. After about an hour of walking, the trail completely disappeared. I started feeling uneasy and asked if we were close to the spot they mentioned. David assured me it was just a bit further, but the tone of his voice had changed slightly. It wasn't the same friendly tone from before. I shrugged it off, trying to stay positive. We finally arrived at a clearing. The view was breathtaking, but my discomfort grew. The spot was isolated, far from any marked trails. David suggested we take a break, so we all sat down. They offered me some water and snacks, which I politely declined, sticking to my own supplies. As we rested, their behavior started to change. They became more silent, exchanging glances that made me feel like an outsider. I decided it was time to head back and mentioned I wanted to return to the main trail. David didn't argue but suggested a different route back, saying it would be faster. I agreed, not wanting to cause any trouble. We started walking again, but this new path felt wrong. It was steep and rugged, clearly not a frequently used trail. I asked if they were sure about the direction, and David snapped, saying he knew where he was going. His sudden anger caught me off guard, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized then how isolated we were. No one would hear me if I screamed. My heart pounded as I weighed my options. I decided to play along for the moment, hoping to find a chance to slip away. Sarah and Emily were walking closer to me now, too close for comfort. Their friendly facade was gone. After another half hour, I saw a chance. We reached a narrow section of the path with dense trees on either side. I pretended to tie my shoe, slowing down enough to let them get a bit ahead. Then, without warning, I bolted into the trees, running as fast as I could. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The terrain was rough, branches scratching my arms and face. I kept running, adrenaline pushing me forward. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto a familiar trail. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached a group of hikers. Breathless and terrified, I explained what had happened. They stayed with me, guiding me back to the main area of the park where I reported the incident to the rangers. I gave a detailed description of the trio, but I never saw them again. The rangers assured me they would investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere in the park. I cut my trip short and returned home, shaken but safe. The experience haunted me for weeks. I had always been careful, never expecting such danger in a place I loved. I learned to trust my instincts and never let my guard down, no matter how friendly strangers might seem. That hike changed me. Yosemite, a place of beauty and peace, now held a darker memory. I still love hiking, but I'm more cautious now. I was working as a lifeguard at a beach in Florida last summer. It was a hot day, and the beach was crowded with families. The sun was shining, kids were playing in the sand, and people were swimming in the clear blue water. It seemed like just another typical day. Around midday, I noticed a group of men sitting on the beach. There were 4 of them, all in their late 30s or early 40s. They looked out of place. While everyone else was enjoying the sun or splashing in the water, these men were just sitting there, not talking much, just watching. At first, I thought they might just be friends hanging out, but something felt off. They weren't looking at the ocean or the scenery. They were watching the children. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't. I kept an eye on them, pretending to scan the beach as part of my usual routine. As the day went on, their behavior got stranger. They would whisper to each other, point subtly, and then split up, each man taking a different position around the beach. It was like they were forming a perimeter. My heart started to race. I had never seen anything like this before. I decided to get a closer look, so I walked down the beach, making it seem like I was just patrolling. When I got near one of the men, he glanced at me, then quickly looked away. I tried to stay calm, but the look in his eyes was chilling. It was like he knew I was onto him. I went back to my lifeguard stand and grabbed my binoculars. I scanned the beach, focusing on the men. They were definitely watching the kids. One of them even had a camera, pretending to take pictures of the ocean but clearly aiming it at the children. My stomach churned. I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I couldn't just accuse them without proof. I decided to call the beach security. I explained what I had seen and my concerns. They said they would send someone over to check it out, but I could tell they weren't taking it as seriously as I was. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept my eyes on the men, my heart pounding. They were getting bolder, moving closer to the kids. I saw one of them approach a group of children playing by the water. He knelt down, pretending to be friendly, talking to them. The kids didn't seem to sense any danger. Finally, I saw the security officer approaching. I waved him over and pointed out the men. He nodded and started walking towards them. As he got closer, the men noticed and began to scatter. My pulse quickened. They were trying to get away. The security officer managed to stop one of them, asking questions. The man was calm, too calm, like he had done this before. The other 3 were moving quickly, heading towards the parking lot. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my whistle and blew it, loud and sharp, to get everyone's attention. People looked up, startled. I shouted, "Watch your children. There are men trying to take them." Parents immediately gathered their kids, pulling them close. The beach was in chaos. The security officer called for backup, and more guards arrived. They managed to catch 2 of the other men before they reached their cars. The last one got away, running into the nearby streets. The police were called, and soon the beach was swarming with officers. The men were arrested and taken away. I later found out they were part of a child trafficking ring. The police said my quick thinking might have saved several children that day. It was a terrifying experience, and I couldn't shake the image of those men watching the kids. I was praised for my actions, but it didn't feel like enough. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me. I'm more vigilant now, always watching, always ready. That day changed me forever. I'm grateful those children were safe, but I know there are others out there who might not be so lucky. I decided to take a solo road trip through the Midwest. I wanted to clear my head, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. Everything was going well until my car broke down in a small town. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was beating down hard. My engine just sputtered and died. I managed to pull over to the side of the road. The town seemed quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see many people around, but I figured I'd just find a mechanic and get back on my way. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. Typical. So, I decided to walk into town and look for assistance. As I walked, I noticed the place had an eerie feel to it. The houses looked old and worn, like they hadn't been maintained in years. I finally saw a small garage with a sign that said Joe's Auto Repair. I walked in, and a man in greasy overalls looked up from under a car hood. "Car trouble?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, it just died on me," I replied. "Can you take a look?" "Sure thing," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He grabbed his tools and followed me back to my car. As he worked on it, I noticed a couple of other locals standing around, watching us. They were just standing there, not talking, just watching. It made me uneasy. After a while, Joe said he needed to tow the car to the garage to get a better look. He called over 2 other men to help. They hooked up my car and we all walked back to the garage. Joe started working on it, and I waited in a small office area. The 2 men from before stood outside, still watching me. After about an hour, Joe came back in. "Bad news," he said. "It's gonna take a few days to get the parts one need to fix it." I felt a knot in my stomach. "A few days? Is there any way to make it faster?" He shook his head. "Not unless you want to try your luck in another town, but that could be risky. Best to stay put." I didn't have much choice, so I agreed. Joe offered to put me up in a small room above the garage for the night. I was tired and didn't feel like arguing, so I accepted. The room was small and musty, but it had a bed and a bathroom. I locked the door and tried to relax. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, like footsteps and whispers. At one point, I thought I heard someone trying the doorknob. My heart raced, but eventually, the noises stopped. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I went downstairs, and Joe was already working on my car. He smiled when he saw me, but it still didn't feel right. I decided to take a walk and see if I could get a better signal on my phone. As I walked through the town, I noticed people watching me from their windows. It felt like every eye in the town was on me. I found a small diner and went in, hoping to get some food and maybe some information. The waitress seemed friendly enough, but when I asked about the town, she got nervous. She told me it was best to stick close to Joe's place and not wander around too much. I went back to the garage, feeling more uneasy than ever. Joe told me he was still waiting on parts and that it might be another day or 2. I nodded and went back to my room. That night was worse. I heard more noises, louder this time. Footsteps right outside my door, and once, I swear I heard someone whispering my name. I was too scared to sleep. I sat up in bed, clutching my phone, even though I knew I had no signal. When morning came, I was exhausted but determined to get out of there. I went downstairs, but Joe was gone. One of the other men from before was there, and he gave me a creepy smile. Joe had to step out. Said he'd be back later, he said. I didn't believe him, but I nodded and went back outside. I decided to take my chances and try to find a way out of town on foot. As I walked, I felt like I was being followed. I looked back and saw a few of the locals trailing behind me, just far enough to be unsettling. I picked up my pace, but so did they. I started to panic. I saw a small road leading out of town and started running. The men behind me started running too. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe, but I kept running. I finally saw a car coming down the road. I waved my arms and screamed for help. The car stopped, and an older couple inside asked what was wrong. I told them everything as quickly as I could, and they told me to get in. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the men standing at the edge of the town, watching us leave. The couple took me to the nearest town, and I called the police. They went back to investigate, but they didn't find anything unusual. Joe's garage was closed, and the town seemed deserted. No one knew where the locals had gone. I got my car fixed in the new town and continued my trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, I get chills thinking about it. I've never felt so scared in my life. I don't know what those people wanted, and I'm not sure I want to know. Last summer, some friends and I decided to go camping in the Ozark Mountains. We wanted a break from the city and thought a few nights in the wilderness would be perfect. There were 5 of us: Mike, Sarah, Jake, Lisa, and me. We set up camp in a secluded spot, far from any trails. The first day was great. We hiked, swam in a nearby creek, and cooked dinner over a campfire. By nightfall, we were exhausted and went to bed early. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. It was pitch black and dead quiet, except for the usual sounds of the forest. I looked around our campsite and noticed something strange. Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa were all gone. Their sleeping bags were empty, and there was no sign of them. Panic started to set in. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around, hoping to see them coming back from a late-night bathroom break or something. But the light caught something else. There were figures, at least 6 of them, standing at the edge of our campsite. They were armed with rifles and wore dark clothes. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, not sure what to do. One of the men stepped forward and told me to stay quiet. His voice was cold and calm. I didn't recognize him, and he didn't look like he belonged to any search and rescue team. He told me to get up slowly and follow him. I had no choice. I got out of my sleeping bag, trying not to make any sudden moves. The other men surrounded me, their rifles pointed at me. They led me away from the campsite, deeper into the woods. We walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only about 20 minutes. They took me to a small clearing where there was an old, beat-up van. They opened the back doors, and inside I saw Mike, Sarah, Jake, and Lisa. They were tied up and gagged. Relief washed over me for a second, knowing they were alive, but then fear took over again. They shoved me into the van and tied my hands behind my back. One of the men stayed in the back with us while the others got into the front and started driving. The man in the back kept his rifle trained on us, his eyes cold and hard. No one spoke. The tension was thick, and my mind raced with thoughts of what they wanted and where they were taking us. I tried to think of a way out, but with my hands tied and a rifle pointed at us, there was nothing I could do. After what felt like hours, the van finally stopped. They dragged us out and led us into a small, abandoned cabin. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years. They tied us to chairs and then left us alone, locking the door behind them. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no way to escape. We sat in silence, listening to the men talking outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound good. Every minute felt like an hour. My mind kept going to dark places, imagining the worst. Eventually, one of the men came back in. He looked at us and smirked. He told us we were going to be fine if we just did as we were told. He didn't say what that meant, but his tone made it clear that not obeying was not an option. Hours passed, maybe even a full day. We had no sense of time. They didn't feed us or give us any water. My mouth was dry, and my stomach was in knots. All we could do was wait and hope for a chance to escape. Then, late in the night, we heard yelling outside. It sounded like a fight had broken out among the men. This was our chance. Somehow, in the chaos, they had left the door unlocked. Mike managed to free himself and then the rest of us. We were shaky and scared, but we knew we had to move fast. We slipped out of the cabin and ran into the woods. We didn't know where we were going, just that we needed to get as far away as possible. We could hear the men shouting behind us, but the darkness was on our side. We stumbled through the forest, tripping over roots and branches, but we didn't stop. Eventually, we found a small creek and followed it. We hoped it would lead us to safety. After what felt like hours, we saw lights ahead. We stumbled into a small campsite where a family was vacationing. They looked at us, confused and scared, but when they saw our condition, they quickly called for help. The authorities arrived, and we told them everything. They searched the area but didn't find the men or the cabin. We were taken to a nearby town, given food and water, and eventually reunited with our families. The police continued their search, but as far as I know, they never found those men. I still think about that night often. The fear, the helplessness, it's all still so vivid. Last summer, I rented a cabin in the Adirondacks for a week. I needed to get away from everything, and the mountains seemed like the perfect place. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by trees and not too far from a small lake. It was exactly what I was looking for, peace and quiet. The first couple of days were great. I spent my time hiking, swimming in the lake, and just relaxing on the porch with a book. I barely saw anyone else. It was like having my own private retreat. The cabin itself was cozy, with a small kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom upstairs. On the third day, I decided to do some cleaning. I was wiping down the living room when I noticed something odd. There was a small hole in the bookshelf, just above eye level. I looked closer and saw a tiny lens inside. It was a camera. My heart started pounding. I quickly checked the rest of the room and found another one behind a picture frame on the wall. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me. I tried to stay calm and think. I needed to check the rest of the cabin. I went upstairs to the bedroom and found another camera in the smoke detector. The bathroom had one too, hidden in the vent. There was even one in the kitchen, inside a clock on the wall. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I thought about driving there, but my car was parked outside in plain view. Whoever was watching might see me leaving. I felt trapped. I decided to pack my things quietly, hoping to leave without drawing attention. As I was stuffing my clothes into my bag, I heard a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. I peeked out the window and saw the landlord standing on the porch. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, and he looked friendly enough when I first met him. But now, knowing he'd been spying on me, he seemed sinister. I didn't answer the door. I just stood there, frozen, hoping he would go away. After a few minutes, he knocked again, harder this time. "Is everything all right in there?" he called out. His voice sounded concerned, but I didn't trust it. I stayed silent. Eventually, he left, but I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my bag and crept out the back door, staying low. I made my way through the trees, heading toward the main road. It was a long walk, but I hoped I could find a signal and call for help. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the landlord following me. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. The sun was setting, and the woods were getting darker. I finally reached the road and started walking toward the town. It was another few miles, but I had no other choice. After about an hour, I saw headlights coming up the road. I waved my arms, hoping it was someone who could help. The car slowed down and stopped. A middle-aged couple was inside. I told them what happened, and they immediately called the police. They let me sit in their car while we waited for the officers to arrive. The police came and took my statement. They went back to the cabin with me and found the cameras. They arrested the landlord that night. It turned out he had been renting the cabin for years and had been spying on all his guests. There were dozens of recordings on his computer. The whole experience left me shaken. I thought I was going to have a relaxing week in the mountains, but it turned into a nightmare. I still have trouble sleeping, thinking about those cameras and how he watched my every move. I decided to go backpacking in the Swiss Alps. It was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the time and savings to make it happen. The scenery was incredible, and the weather was perfect. I spent the first few days hiking through valleys and over mountain passes, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the landscape. On the fourth day, I met another solo hiker. His name was Lucas, or at least that's what he told me. He was around my age, mid-30s, with short brown hair and a friendly demeanor. We started talking and ended up hiking together for most of the day. He seemed knowledgeable about the area and even gave me some tips on where to camp and which trails to take. We set up camp near a small lake that evening. Lucas seemed relaxed, and we shared stories about our travels and lives back home. He said he was from Germany and was taking some time off to explore the Alps. He had a charming way about him, and I felt at ease in his company. The next day, we continued hiking together. But as the day went on, I started to notice little things that didn't quite add up. He seemed to know too much about avoiding main trails and finding secluded spots. His gear was top-notch, almost like he was prepared for more than just a casual hike. That night, as we sat by the campfire, Lucas became more serious. He asked me if I had told anyone where I was going or when I planned to return. It seemed like an odd question, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I told him I had given my itinerary to a friend back home. The next morning, I woke up to find Lucas already awake and packing his things. He looked tense, and his friendly demeanor was gone. He told me he needed to move quickly and that it was best if we split up. I was confused but agreed, thinking maybe he just wanted to hike alone again. As I packed my own gear, I noticed my wallet was missing. Panic set in. I confronted Lucas, but he denied taking it. I didn't believe him, but I was alone in the mountains with no way to prove it. I decided to leave and head back to a more populated area as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. But around midday, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lucas approaching. He had a desperate look in his eyes. He admitted he had taken my wallet and begged me to help him. He said he was in trouble and needed a new identity to escape. He was a fugitive, wanted for something he wouldn't specify. I was terrified. Here was this man, someone I had thought of as a friend, revealing he was on the run and willing to do anything to stay free. He pleaded with me to switch identities, to take his documents and give him mine. I refused, knowing it was a bad idea, but he became agitated. He grabbed my arm and tried to take my backpack. I struggled, but he was stronger. I managed to break free and ran down the trail, my heart pounding. I could hear him chasing me, yelling at me to stop. I didn't look back, just kept running as fast as I could. Eventually, I came to a small village. I ran to the nearest building, which turned out to be a small inn, and begged the owner to call the police. The owner saw the fear in my eyes and immediately called. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, but the innkeeper stood between us, telling him to leave. Lucas hesitated, then turned and walked away. The police arrived soon after. I told them everything. They took my statement and searched the area but couldn't find Lucas. They assured me they would continue looking, but I knew he was long gone. They helped me get a replacement ID and enough money to get back home. I finished my trip early and returned home, shaken but safe. The experience left me wary of strangers, and I still get anxious when I think about it. The Swiss Alps were supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead, they became the backdrop to the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm just grateful I managed to get out of there alive. Last summer, I went to a music festival in California with a group of friends. It was supposed to be an amazing weekend, 3 days of music, camping, and fun. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents, danced to our favorite bands, and made a lot of memories. The crowd was huge, and it was easy to get lost in it, but we all stuck together. On the second day, things took a turn. In the afternoon, we were all at the main stage. The sun was blazing, and the music was loud. I remember we were dancing when I suddenly lost sight of my friends. It was packed, and I got pushed by the crowd. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. I tried to find them, but it was hopeless. I walked around for what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, but there was no signal. I was getting more anxious by the minute. The sun started to set, and the crowd was getting rowdier. I felt alone and vulnerable. That's when a man approached me. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a friendly smile and a calm voice. He asked if I was okay. I told him I lost my friends and couldn't find them. He offered to help me look for them. At that moment, I was grateful. He seemed kind, and I didn't know what else to do. We walked together, weaving through the crowd. He kept talking, trying to keep me calm. He asked about my friends, what they looked like, and where I had last seen them. I answered all his questions, thinking he was just being helpful. But then he suggested we go to a quieter area where it would be easier to hear my phone if it rang. Something felt off, but I was too scared and desperate to find my friends to think straight. We left the main area and walked toward the edge of the festival grounds. The music was distant now, and the crowd was thinning out. We reached a secluded spot near some trees. He said we should wait there for a bit, that maybe my friends would try to call or text. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. That's when I noticed his demeanor change. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at me with a strange intensity. He moved closer, too close. Alarm bells went off in my head, and I knew I needed to get away from him. I made an excuse about needing to use the restroom and started to walk away. He grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to scare me. He said it wasn't safe for me to go alone and that he would come with me. My heart was racing. I pulled my arm free and told him I'd be quick. I walked away fast, trying not to run and draw attention. Once I was out of sight, I started running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. I found myself near the camping area, and I ducked behind a row of tents. I crouched down, trying to catch my breath and calm my nerves. I stayed hidden for a while, listening for any sign that he had followed me. It was dark now, and the festival lights were a faint glow in the distance. My phone finally picked up a signal, and I quickly texted my friends, telling them where I was and what had happened. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I saw familiar faces. My friends found me and hugged me tightly. I broke down, telling them everything. They were shocked and angry that someone had taken advantage of the situation. We went to the festival security and reported the man. They took it seriously and said they would look for him. The rest of the festival was a blur. I couldn't relax or enjoy the music anymore. We stuck together like glue, never letting anyone out of sight. When it was over, I was relieved to go home. The experience left me shaken. I thought about how easily things could have gone worse. I haven't been to a festival since. The thought of getting lost in a crowd again terrifies me. I went on a cycling trip through rural France. I wanted to see the countryside and enjoy some time away from the city. I planned a route that would take me through small villages and scenic roads. It was peaceful and beautiful, exactly what I needed. On the third day, I was cycling down a quiet, winding road when I lost control of my bike. I hit a patch of gravel and went down hard. I scraped my knee and twisted my ankle pretty badly. I sat on the side of the road, trying to figure out what to do. My bike was damaged, and I could barely stand. A car pulled up next to me. A man and woman got out and asked if I was okay. They spoke French, and my French wasn't great, but I understood enough. They were offering to help. They introduced themselves as Pierre and Marie. They said their house was just a few kilometers away and that I could stay there until I felt better. I didn't have many options, so I agreed. They helped me into their car and put my bike in the trunk. As we drove, I thanked them and tried to make small talk. They seemed friendly enough. Pierre was in his late 40s, and Marie looked a bit younger. They told me they had a small farm and that I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. When we arrived at their house, it was charming and rustic. A little farmhouse surrounded by fields. They showed me to a small guest room and brought me some ice for my ankle. Marie made me some tea, and Pierre said he would look at my bike in the morning. That night, I had dinner with them. The food was simple but delicious. We talked about my trip and their life on the farm. They seemed genuinely interested and kind. I started to feel more at ease, thinking I had just met some good Samaritans. The next morning, Pierre told me my bike needed some repairs that he couldn't do himself. He said he would take it to a friend's shop in the next village, but it might take a couple of days. I didn't mind too much, as my ankle was still sore. I spent the day resting and exploring the farm. As the days passed, I noticed little things that made me uneasy. Pierre and Marie were always watching me, never letting me out of their sight. They were overly attentive, asking about my plans and making sure I didn't leave the property. One evening, I tried to make a phone call, but I couldn't get a signal. Pierre mentioned the reception was bad in the area and suggested I use their landline. When I tried, the line was dead. By the fourth day, I was getting really uncomfortable. I asked Pierre about my bike, and he said his friend was still working on it. That night, after dinner, I heard them talking in the kitchen. They were speaking in hushed tones, but I caught bits and pieces. They were discussing me, saying things like he's not going anywhere and we'll keep him safe. My heart raced. I realized they had no intention of letting me leave. I needed to get out of there. I decided to leave that night. I packed a small bag with some essentials and waited until I was sure they were asleep. Then, I quietly left the house and started walking down the road. My ankle still hurt, but adrenaline kept me moving. It was pitch dark, and the countryside was eerily quiet. I walked for hours, terrified they would come after me. Eventually, I reached a small village. I found a payphone and called the police. I explained my situation as best as I could, and they sent a car to pick me up. The police took my statement and drove me back to their station. They asked me if I wanted to press charges, but I just wanted to go home. They helped me contact a friend who arranged for a flight back to my country. I never found out what Pierre and Marie's true intentions were, and I don't want to think about it too much. I was just glad to be safe. The whole experience left me shaken. What started as a peaceful cycling trip turned into a nightmare. I volunteered at a summer camp in Maine. It was a beautiful place, surrounded by thick forests and a large, clear lake. I had always loved working with kids, and this seemed like a perfect way to spend my summer. The camp was full of laughter and excitement, with activities like swimming, hiking, and arts and crafts. The first week went smoothly. I got to know the other counselors and bonded with the kids in my group. There was one staff member, Tom, who stood out. He was in his late 30s, quiet, and always seemed a bit off. He was responsible for maintenance and often kept to himself, but I noticed him watching the kids a little too closely at times. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just shy or awkward. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I went to the staff lounge to unwind. I overheard a conversation between Tom and another counselor, Sarah. She was asking him why he spent so much time near the kids' cabins. His answers were vague and dismissive, saying he was just doing his job. Sarah looked uncomfortable but didn't press further. The next day, I noticed Tom hanging around the arts and crafts area, even though he had no reason to be there. He kept glancing at the kids, especially the younger ones. I felt uneasy and decided to keep an eye on him. During lunch, I saw him slip something into his pocket from the kitchen. It looked like a small bottle, but I couldn't tell what it was. I mentioned it to the camp director, who brushed it off, saying Tom was just doing his job. That evening, I found a note in my cabin. It was from Sarah, asking me to meet her by the lake after lights out. When I got there, she looked scared. She told me she had found some disturbing things in Tom's cabin, maps of the camp with marks around the kids' cabins, a stash of small bottles like the one I saw him take, and a journal with notes about the kids. We knew we had to do something, but we couldn't go to the camp director without more proof. We decided to keep watch that night. Around midnight, we saw Tom sneaking around the cabins. He was carrying a backpack and looked like he was trying to stay hidden. We followed him at a distance, staying as quiet as possible. He went to the cabin where the youngest kids were sleeping. My heart was pounding. Sarah and I exchanged a look and decided to confront him. As we approached, we saw him take one of the bottles out of his backpack and pour the contents into a water bottle in the cabin. That was it, we had to stop him. We stepped out from behind the trees and called his name. He jumped and dropped the bottle, which shattered on the ground. Tom tried to make up an excuse, saying he was just checking on the kids, but we didn't believe him. Sarah grabbed the water bottle he had tampered with, and I told him we were going to the camp director. Tom's demeanor changed instantly. He lunged at Sarah, trying to grab the bottle. I screamed for help, hoping someone would hear us. We struggled with him, and he managed to knock the bottle out of Sarah's hand, but not before I had taken a picture of it with my phone. Just then, a few other counselors who had heard the commotion came running. Tom realized he was outnumbered and tried to run, but they tackled him and held him down until the camp director arrived. We explained everything and showed the picture as proof. The director called the police. The police arrived and took Tom away. They searched his cabin and found more evidence of his plans. It turned out he had a history of mental illness and had been off his medication. The bottles contained sedatives, and he had intended to drug the kids. The rest of the summer was tense, but we tried to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. The camp director increased security, and we all kept a closer eye on everything. The kids never found out the full story, and we made sure they stayed safe and had fun. By the end of the summer, I was exhausted and still shaken by what had happened. I was just glad we had been able to stop Tom before he could hurt anyone. My buddies and I planned this fishing trip to Alaska for months. We all needed a break, so when summer rolled around, we packed up our gear and headed out. It was me, Tom, Jerry, and Mike. We'd been friends since high school, and fishing trips were our thing. This time, we wanted to go somewhere remote, away from everything. We found this little spot on a map, far off any beaten path, and figured it was perfect. We flew into Anchorage and rented a couple of trucks, driving hours on rough roads until the GPS showed we were in the right area. The place was beautiful, surrounded by trees and right next to a crystal clear lake. We set up camp, got our rods ready, and started fishing. The first couple of days were great. We caught some big ones, laughed around the campfire, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. On the third day, we decided to explore a bit further from our camp. We took one of the trucks and drove deeper into the woods. About an hour in, the dirt road got narrower and rougher, almost like it wasn't used much. We were about to turn back when Jerry spotted a trail that looked like it led to another part of the lake. We figured we'd check it out, maybe find a better fishing spot. The trail was narrow, and branches scratched the sides of the truck as we drove. After about 15 minutes, we came to a clearing. But instead of another scenic view, we saw something that made us stop in our tracks. There was a small building, like a shack, and several men were moving crates from a boat to a truck. Tom killed the engine, and we sat there, watching. It didn't take long to realize something was off. The men were armed, and they kept looking around nervously. Mike whispered that we should get out of there, but before we could back up, one of the men spotted us. He yelled, and suddenly all eyes were on us. Panic set in. Tom tried to reverse, but the truck got stuck in a rut. The men started running towards us, shouting. Jerry grabbed his hunting rifle from the back seat, but before he could do anything, one of the men fired a shot that shattered our windshield. We ducked, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. "Get out of the truck," one of the men yelled. We had no choice. We slowly opened the doors and stepped out, hands raised. They surrounded us, guns pointed at our heads. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "Who are you?" the leader barked. "What are you doing here?" "We're just on a fishing trip," Tom said, his voice shaking. "We didn't mean to trespass." The leader eyed us for a moment, then nodded to one of his men. "Check their truck." The guy rifled through our stuff, tossing our gear out. When he didn't find anything suspicious, he reported back. "They're clean." The leader seemed to relax a bit but didn't lower his gun. "You picked the wrong spot to fish. This here is private property, and we don't like trespassers." "We didn't know," Mike said. "We'll leave right now and never come back." "We swear," The leader thought about it for a moment, then gestured to the shack. Get in there. We were herded into the small building, which smelled of gasoline and sweat. They locked us inside and posted guards outside. The four of us sat on the floor, too scared to speak. Hours passed. The light from the single window dimmed as the sun set. Night fell, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. We whispered about what they might be doing. Drugs? Smuggling? Whatever it was, we knew we were in deep trouble. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and we dozed off, one by one. I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. The leader stood there, silhouetted by the moonlight. Get up, he ordered. You're leaving. We scrambled to our feet, barely believing our luck. They marched us back to our truck, which they pulled free. Drive straight out of here. If we ever see you again, you won't get another chance. We piled into the truck and Tom floored it. As we sped down the trail, I kept looking back, half expecting them to change their minds and come after us. But they didn't. We didn't stop until we reached our camp. We packed up our gear in record time and drove straight to the nearest town. Once we had cell service, we called the local authorities. We didn't know if they'd do anything, but we had to report what we saw. We cut our trip short and headed back home, shaken but safe. It was a long time before we went on another fishing trip. And when we did, we made sure it was in a well-known, crowded spot. I went to a remote island to study marine biology. It was a great opportunity. My mentor, Dr. Carlson, was known for his work with marine life, and I was excited to learn from him. The island was far from the mainland, with only a small research station and a few cabins. The first few weeks were amazing. We saw dolphins, sharks, and all kinds of fish. Dr. Carlson was intense but seemed dedicated to his work. He often went off alone for hours, saying he needed to collect samples. I didn't think much of it at first. One day, I noticed something strange. Dr. Carlson had a locked room in the research station. When I asked about it, he got defensive and told me it was just storage. His reaction made me curious, but I didn't push it. I figured he had his reasons. Late one night, I couldn't sleep and decided to go for a walk. As I passed the research station, I heard noises coming from the locked room. It sounded like machinery and something else, like muffled cries. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The next day, Dr. Carlson was more secretive than usual. He kept checking the locked room and didn't seem to notice I was watching. When he left for one of his solo trips, I decided to take a look. I found a set of keys in his office and managed to unlock the door. What I saw inside was horrifying. There were tanks with creatures I didn't recognize, and some of them looked like they were in pain. There were also surgical tools and blood stains. I realized Dr. Carlson wasn't just studying marine life, he was experimenting on it, and the experiments were cruel. I quickly locked the door and put the keys back before he returned. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confront him. He was much stronger and had control over everything on the island. I decided to gather evidence and report him when we returned to the mainland. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I heard footsteps outside my cabin and peeked out the window. Dr. Carlson was standing there, staring at my door. My blood ran cold. He knew I had been in the room. The next morning, he acted like nothing was wrong, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to go about my work, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get off the island, but the next supply boat wasn't due for a week. I stayed out of his way as much as possible, but he cornered me in the lab. "You've been snooping," he said. I tried to deny it, but he grabbed my arm. "You know too much. You're not leaving this island." I managed to break free and ran to my cabin, locking the door behind me. I knew I had to find a way to call for help. There was a radio in the research station, but I needed a distraction. I remembered the flares we kept for emergencies and grabbed one. As night fell, I set off the flare near the edge of the island. It lit up the sky, and I heard Dr. Carlson cursing as he ran towards it. With him distracted, I dashed to the research station and grabbed the radio. I called for help, my voice shaking. "This is an emergency. I'm on island name with Dr. Carlson. He's conducting illegal experiments and is threatening me. Please, send help." I didn't know if anyone heard me, but I couldn't stay in the research station. I ran back to my cabin and barricaded the door. Hours passed in silence, and then I heard the sound of a helicopter. Relief washed over me. Dr. Carlson tried to stop them, but the authorities overpowered him. They found the evidence I had seen and more. He was arrested, and I was taken to safety. I learned later that he had been under suspicion for a while, but no one had been able to prove anything until now. It took me a long time to recover from that experience. I still love marine biology, but I'm much more careful about who I trust. That summer changed everything for me. I packed up my old sedan, filled it with snacks, water, and some camping gear, and hit the road. The desert was vast and empty, the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I had been driving for hours when I saw a figure on the side of the road, thumb out, looking desperate. At first, I was hesitant to stop. You hear so many stories about picking up strangers, but something about this guy made me pull over. He looked rough, dirty, and scared. He got in the car without saying much. Just thanked me and asked if I could take him as far as I was going. I nodded and we drove in silence for a while. His name was Jake, and he was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder. After about an hour, he started to open up. He told me he was running from a gang. He had gotten involved with them, and now they wanted him dead. I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't give too many details, but it was clear he was in serious trouble. We drove for a few more hours, and as the sun started to set, I began looking for a place to camp for the night. I found a small, deserted rest stop with a few picnic tables and an old, run-down bathroom. It seemed as good a place as any to stop. We set up a small camp, and I shared some of my food with Jake. He seemed more relaxed, but I could tell he was still on edge. As night fell, the desert became eerily quiet. We sat by a small fire, the only light in the vast darkness. Around midnight, I heard the sound of engines in the distance. Jake's face went pale. "They're coming," he whispered. "We need to hide." We quickly put out the fire and grabbed our stuff. There was an old building nearby, maybe an abandoned service station. We ran inside and hid behind some rusted equipment. The engines got louder, and soon I saw headlights sweeping across the desert. A few trucks pulled up to the rest stop. Men got out, armed and looking angry. They started searching the area, shouting Jake's name. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. Jake was shaking beside me, his eyes wide with terror. One of the men kicked over the picnic table we had been sitting at. "He can't be far," he growled. They spread out, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they found us. We needed a plan. I whispered to Jake that we should try to make a run for the car. He nodded, and we waited until the men were on the other side of the rest stop. We moved as quietly as we could, slipping out of the building and heading towards the car. We were almost there when one of them spotted us. "There they are," he shouted. We sprinted the last few yards to the car, bullets whizzing past us. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, but managed to get the door open. We jumped in, and I started the engine, flooring it as we sped away. The trucks gave chase, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. The road was rough, and the car bounced and swerved as I tried to keep control. Jake was shouting directions, telling me to take turns onto smaller roads, hoping to lose them in the maze of desert trails. We drove for what felt like hours, the trucks slowly falling behind. Finally, we found a narrow, rocky path that the trucks couldn't follow. I kept driving until we were sure we had lost them. We stopped in a secluded spot, hidden by rocks and scrub. Both of us were panting, drenched in sweat. We stayed there until dawn, too scared to move. When the sun rose, we cautiously made our way back to the main road. We didn't talk much after that. I drove Jake to the nearest town, where he said he had friends who could help him. He thanked me, genuinely grateful, and disappeared into the crowd. I continued my road trip, but the rest of the journey felt different. The desert wasn't as peaceful anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I got back home, I realized how close I had come to something truly dangerous. I still think about Jake sometimes, wondering if he ever found safety or if the gang caught up to him. I needed to clear my head and just drive, see where the roads would take me. I had everything packed in my old car: clothes, snacks, a few books, and a tent in case I wanted to camp out somewhere. I loved the freedom of the open road, the endless possibilities. After a long day of driving through the Arizona desert, the sun was setting, and I started looking for a place to stay. I was tired and didn't want to set up the tent. I saw a sign for a motel just off the highway. It looked old but decent enough for one night. I pulled in and went to the office. The man behind the counter, who I assumed was the owner, smiled too much. His name tag said Sam. He looked me up and down before handing me the key to room 7. The whole place had a weird vibe, but I was too tired to care. I thanked him and headed to my room. The room was small and smelled musty. I tried to ignore it and settled in, locking the door and double-checking the windows. After a quick shower, I lay on the bed, scrolling through my phone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard voices, hushed but urgent. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. There were 2 men talking near a van parked a few rooms down. One of them was Sam. They were looking at something in the back of the van, but I couldn't see what. My heart started racing. I decided to stay awake and keep an eye out. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. The voices faded, but my unease didn't. I was about to try and get some sleep when I heard footsteps approaching my door. My stomach dropped. There was a soft knock, followed by Sam's voice. "Everything okay in there?" he asked. I didn't respond. He knocked again, louder this time. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable," he said, his voice almost mocking. I held my breath, praying he would go away. After what felt like an eternity, he did. I heard him mutter something before his footsteps retreated. I waited a few minutes, then quickly packed my things. I needed to get out of there. Just as I was about to unlock the door, I heard a scraping sound coming from the window. I turned and saw a man trying to pry it open. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering my location and the situation. The operator told me to stay on the line and find a place to hide. I shoved the dresser against the door and crawled under the bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The window finally gave way, and I heard the man climb in. He moved slowly, his footsteps heavy on the old carpet. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. He walked around the room, opening drawers and looking under the bed next to mine. I watched his feet through the gap, praying he wouldn't check my side. He stopped right in front of me, and I held my breath. Then, suddenly, he turned and left. I heard him talking to someone outside. I stayed under the bed until I heard the sirens. The relief was overwhelming. The police arrived and found me still hiding. They caught Sam and his accomplice trying to flee. The officers told me that the motel was a front for a human trafficking ring. They had been watching the place for weeks but hadn't expected to find someone in immediate danger. I gave my statement and was taken to a safe place for the night. The next day, I continued my road trip, but I was more cautious, more aware of the places I chose to stay. That night haunted me for a long time. The fear, the close call, it all felt too real, too raw. But I was alive, and for that, I was grateful. I took a job as a park ranger in Yellowstone. I needed a change from my usual routine, and the idea of spending a summer in nature sounded perfect. The park was beautiful, and I loved my job. Most days were peaceful, just guiding tourists, checking trails, and enjoying the scenery. One evening, I was patrolling a less traveled part of the park. It was getting dark, and I was about to head back when I heard something strange. It sounded like a gunshot, which was unusual and alarming. Hunting was strictly prohibited in the park. I decided to check it out, thinking maybe it was a misfire from a camper, though that was unlikely. I followed the sound through the trees, moving quietly. After about 10 minutes, I saw a light ahead and crouched behind some bushes. There were two men standing around a campfire, talking in hushed tones. Between them, on the ground, was a large dead elk. They were clearly not supposed to be there. One of the men was cleaning a rifle, while the other was packing up their gear. They looked serious and focused. I knew I had to report this, but my radio was back in the truck. I slowly started to back away, trying not to make any noise. But then I stepped on a branch, and it snapped loudly. Both men looked up instantly. "Who's there?" one of them shouted, grabbing his gun. I froze, heart pounding. They started walking towards my direction. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. I heard them shouting and the crack of a gunshot. My only thought was to get back to the truck and call for help. The forest was dense, and it was hard to move quickly, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the faint glow of the park road up ahead. I was close. Another shot rang out, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I bit down a scream and kept running. When I finally reached my truck, I threw myself inside and locked the doors. My arm was bleeding badly, but I managed to grab the radio and call for backup. I could hear the men shouting in the distance, but I didn't wait to see if they were coming closer. I started the truck and drove as fast as I could back towards the ranger station. The pain in my arm was getting worse, but I couldn't stop now. When I arrived at the station, a couple of other rangers were already there. I explained what happened, and they called for more help. I was taken to the small medical clinic in the park, where they treated my arm. The bullet had just grazed me, but it was still deep enough to need stitches. Later that night, the park was swarming with law enforcement. They found the campfire and the remains of the elk, but the poachers were long gone. I gave my statement to the police, describing the men as best as I could. They promised to increase patrols and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. The rest of the summer, I was more on edge. Every sound in the forest seemed louder, every shadow more threatening. I kept my radio close and stuck to the main trails as much as possible. It was hard to relax after that night. By the end of the season, the poachers still hadn't been caught. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things could turn dangerous. I finished my job and went back to my regular life, but I never forgot the terror of being hunted in those dark woods. I agreed to house sit for a friend in the Hamptons. It was a huge mansion, isolated from the rest of the town, surrounded by woods. I thought it would be a relaxing break from my routine. The house had everything you could ask for: a pool, a huge kitchen, and even a home theater. It seemed like the perfect getaway. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time lounging by the pool, reading, and exploring the house. It was a bit too quiet at times, but I enjoyed the solitude. Every night, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows. The house was so big, it took almost 15 minutes to do a full check. On the third night, I was woken up by a noise. It sounded like something scratching against the wall. I brushed it off as an animal outside and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I checked the house but didn't find anything missing or out of place. That night, I double-checked every door and window before going to bed. I lay awake for a while, listening for any sounds. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the same scratching noise, this time coming from downstairs. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed down the stairs, using the flashlight to guide my way. The noise led me to the kitchen. I scanned the room with the flashlight and saw nothing unusual. As I turned to leave, I heard a creak from the pantry. I slowly opened the door, and nothing was there. Feeling a bit foolish, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I found footprints in the mudroom. They weren't mine. Panic set in. Someone had been in the house. I called my friend to ask if anyone else had access to the house, but she assured me that no one should be there. She suggested I call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? I had no proof other than my own fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, sitting in the living room with all the lights on. Around midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I heard footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining that someone was in the house. She told me to stay on the line and hide. I crept into the small closet under the stairs, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear someone moving around in the living room. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring me that help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours. I heard the intruder moving through the house, opening doors and drawers. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I waited, holding my breath, until I heard the police call out. They found me in the closet and escorted me outside. They searched the house but didn't find anyone. However, they did find signs of forced entry at the back door. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The police advised me to stay somewhere else, but I didn't have many options. My friend arranged for a security company to come and install cameras and alarms the next day. I spent the night at a nearby hotel, unable to sleep, replaying the events in my mind. The rest of my time in the Hamptons was uneventful, but I never felt safe again in that house. Every creaking shadow made me jump. When my friend returned, She thanked me and apologized for what happened. I was relieved to leave and promised myself I'd never house sit in such an isolated place again. Looking back, I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and called for help. It could have ended much worse. That summer taught me to always be cautious, no matter how safe a place might seem. My family decided to have a reunion at our lake house in Minnesota. It had been years since we were all together, and the idea of spending a week by the lake sounded perfect. The house was big, with plenty of rooms and a great view of the water. My grandfather, the family patriarch, was especially excited. He loved having everyone around. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, and everyone started catching up. There was a lot of laughter and good food. The first couple of days were relaxing. We swam, fished, and took long walks. Everything seemed perfect, but I noticed some tension between my Uncle Dave and my grandfather. They were often whispering in heated conversations. One evening, I couldn't sleep and went downstairs to get some water. As I walked past the study, I heard voices. My Uncle Dave was talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to understand he was talking about my grandfather and money. He sounded angry and desperate. I felt a chill run down my spine but decided to keep quiet and go back to bed. The next day, things seemed normal, but I couldn't shake off what I heard. I started paying more attention to my uncle. He was always watching my grandfather, especially when he was near the lake. It made me uneasy. I confided in my cousin Sarah, and she told me she had also noticed something strange about Dave. We decided to keep an eye on him together. That night, we stayed up late, pretending to watch TV, but really, we were listening for anything unusual. Around midnight, we heard the back door creak open. We peeked out the window and saw Dave heading towards the lake. We followed him quietly, staying hidden in the shadows. He stopped at the dock and pulled out a small bottle from his pocket, pouring its contents into my grandfather's drink bottle that he always took on his morning walks. My heart was racing. We ran back to the house and debated what to do. We couldn't confront him without proof, and we didn't want to cause a scene without being sure. We decided to wait until morning and warn my grandfather. At dawn, we found my grandfather in the kitchen, getting ready for his walk. We told him what we saw, and he was shocked but believed us. He asked us to stay quiet and let him handle it. He took his drink bottle and walked out as usual, but instead of heading to the lake, he went to my dad's room and showed him the bottle. My dad took the bottle to a friend in town who worked at a lab. By afternoon, we had confirmation. The bottle contained poison. My grandfather called a family meeting, and with everyone gathered, he confronted Dave. At first, Dave denied everything, but when my dad showed him the lab results, he broke down and confessed. He admitted he was in serious debt and needed the inheritance. The police were called, and Dave was taken away. The family was in shock. We never imagined something like this could happen. My grandfather was shaken but relieved that we had stopped Dave before he could do anything worse. The rest of the reunion was somber. We all felt the weight of what could have happened. My grandfather was grateful to us for paying attention and acting on our instincts. The family came together in a way we hadn't before, supporting each other through the ordeal. I left the lake house with a mix of emotions. The place I always associated with happy memories now had a dark shadow over it. But I also felt a strong bond with my family, knowing we had protected one another. A couple of summers back, I decided to take a solo sailing trip in the Caribbean. I had been planning it for years, and it was finally happening. The idea of navigating the open waters, relying on my skills, and experiencing the beauty of the sea was a dream come true. My boat was small but well equipped, perfect for a solo journey. The first few days were perfect. The weather was sunny, and the sea was calm. I followed my planned route, stopping at small islands, enjoying the solitude and the stunning views. It felt like a true escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. On the fourth day, I noticed a boat in the distance. It was drifting, looking a bit out of place. As I got closer, I saw someone on board waving frantically. They looked distressed, and I felt a pang of concern. I decided to approach and see if they needed help. As I pulled up alongside their boat, a man shouted that their engine had died and they needed assistance. Something about the situation felt off, but I brushed it aside, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. I tied my boat to theirs and climbed aboard to see if I could help. The man seemed grateful at first, but then I noticed two other men emerging from below deck. They had a different look about them, rough and intense. My heart started pounding. I realized too late that I had made a terrible mistake. Before I could react, one of the men grabbed me from behind and forced me to sit down. The leader, the one who had waved me over, smirked and told me they were taking my boat. They were pirates, and they had been using the Distress Act to lure in unsuspecting sailors like me. They bound my hands and gagged me, then started transferring supplies from their boat to mine. I felt a mix of fear and anger. I had to find a way out of this. As they were distracted, I noticed a knife on the deck, not far from where I was sitting. I managed to shuffle over and grab the knife, hidden behind my back. My hands were shaking, but I started sawing at the rope. It was slow and painful, but I eventually freed myself. The pirates were busy looting my boat, so they didn't notice right away. When I was free, I waited for the right moment. As one of them passed by, I jumped up and slashed at him, more out of instinct than skill. He yelled in pain, and the others turned, giving me just enough time to dive overboard. I swam under the boat and surfaced on the other side, gasping for air. I knew I had to get to the nearby island, which wasn't too far. I started swimming, my heart pounding with every stroke. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The swim felt like it took forever. I was exhausted, but fear kept me going. When I finally reached the island, I crawled onto the beach and hid behind some rocks, trying to catch my breath and calm down. I could see my boat in the distance, the pirates still on board, but they didn't seem to be looking for me anymore. I stayed hidden until nightfall. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I had to get my boat back or find another way to signal for help. The island seemed deserted, but I started exploring, hoping to find something useful. To my relief, I stumbled upon a small hut with a radio inside. It looked abandoned, but the radio still worked. I managed to send out a distress call, explaining my situation. After what felt like hours, I received a response. A nearby vessel had picked up my signal and was on its way. I stayed hidden in the hut until I saw the lights of the rescue boat approaching. I signaled them with a flashlight I found in the hut. They picked me up and, together, we approached my boat cautiously. The pirates, perhaps sensing trouble, had already fled. The rescue crew helped me secure my boat and check for any damages. I was shaken but incredibly relieved to be safe. They escorted me to the nearest port, where I reported the incident to the authorities. The rest of my trip was canceled. I couldn't shake off the fear and paranoia from that encounter. It took me a long time to feel safe on the water again. Lucky old me landed an internship at a vineyard in Tuscany. It was a dream come true, a chance to learn about winemaking in one of the most beautiful places in the world. The vineyard was owned by a man named Marco, who seemed friendly and passionate about his craft. I was excited to get started and immerse myself in the world of wine. The first few weeks went by smoothly. I worked long days in the vineyards, helping with the grape harvest and learning about the winemaking process. Marco was always around, overseeing everything and offering advice. But as time went on, I started to notice things that didn't quite add up. One day, I overheard Marco talking on the phone in a hushed voice. He was speaking Italian, and I couldn't understand everything, but I caught snippets about shipments and deliveries. It seemed strange, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. A few days later, I was sorting through some paperwork in the office when I found a folder labeled accounts. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside, I found records of transactions that didn't seem related to the vineyard, large sums of money coming in and out, with no explanation. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe Marco had investments or other businesses. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to do some digging. I searched online for information about Marco and the vineyard. What I found sent chills down my spine. There were rumors of the vineyard being a front for organized crime, a way for Marco to launder money and smuggle goods. I felt sick to my stomach. I had stumbled into something dangerous, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the authorities, I didn't have any proof, and I was afraid of what Marco might do if he found out I was onto him. I spent the next few days on edge, trying to act normal while keeping a close eye on Marco. I noticed him talking to some shady-looking characters who came by the vineyard. They exchanged briefcases and whispered conversations, and I knew I had to get out before I got in too deep. I packed a bag with some essentials and waited until late at night when I knew Marco would be asleep. I slipped out of my room and made my way to the front gate. My heart was pounding, and every sound made me jump. But I knew I had to leave. As I reached the gate, I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart in my throat. It was Marco. He had caught me trying to leave. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the house, his grip like iron. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. He dragged me inside and threw me into a chair. He loomed over me, his face twisted in anger. He accused me of snooping around and threatened to silence me if I didn't keep quiet. I was terrified. I didn't know what he was capable of, but I knew I had to get away. I waited for him to let his guard down, and then I made a break for it. I ran out the door and into the night, not looking back. I sprinted through the vineyards, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Marco shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him and the danger he represented. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a heap on the ground. I lay there, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. I had never been so scared in my life. But I was alive. I had escaped Marco and his criminal empire. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that vineyard as possible. I eventually made my way to the nearest town and found a police station. I told them everything, about Marco and the vineyard and what I had discovered. They took my statement and promised to investigate. I never went back to the vineyard. I didn't want to risk running into Marco again. But the experience haunted me, a constant reminder of how quickly things can go wrong and how dangerous the world can be.